So I will tell you about the economic progress of the Baltic states since 1918 or 1919, where our data sets start. And I will try to help answering a question whether Baltic states are in the end success stories of Nordic scale or perhaps Eastern European failures. How many of you think that Baltic states belong to Eastern Europe? Raise your hands, please. Okay, I see one hand. Who would rather assign them to Northern Europe? Nice. Well, there's a reason for that. Nobody wants to be part of Eastern Europe because, according to economic historians, we're talking about history, not today, it is a region of reproduced backwardness. Many of the countries in Eastern or East Central Europe used to be poor before the First World War, poor after the First World War, poor after the Great Depression, poor after the Second World War, and only in the last decades have they started catching up. The Nordics, on the other hand, have been successful all the way 200 years, or even more maybe. So nobody wants to be part of that. But we've only seen the positive developments in the Baltic states for the last 27 years because we don't have any data before that. And the political history seems to coincide with Eastern Europe much more. The population losses, the wartime devastation and everything seems to be better fitting for us to be part of Eastern Europe. So now that we have 100 years of economic growth data, we will be able to more firmly answer the question, where do the Baltic states belong? So about myself, I am a doctoral student at the University of Oxford since 2018, so almost 6 years now. I've been working on the long-run economic statistics of the Baltic states. And besides that, I'm also a cartographer. That's my second job. I'm creating maps. So if anybody interested in that, we can talk about it later. You may ask, first of all, why GDP? There's always this question. GDP doesn't show economic inequality, and that's true. But to be fair, for most normal average countries, an increase in income per capita, which translates to general living standards, leads to usually an increase in perceived life quality. People seem happier when they have more money in normal countries. We're not talking about Africa, we're not talking about Middle East with all the oil, we're talking about average countries like Lithuania, Latvia, France, Germany. The more income you have, the happier you get, which means GDP is a decent indicator of life quality. So that's why we chose it as the primary indicator to start analyzing Baltic states' economic history. And the issue was that there was no reliable data before 1995. We know that the Baltic states have been successful so far, but has this success been reproduced for 100 years, periods of these 100 years? Or is it just a modern phenomenon? We didn't know that. And the Baltic100 project allowed us to answer that. So what we did, and if anybody is interested in the details of gathering this data, come tomorrow to Valmiera. But today I will not bother you with that. What we did, we assembled enormous amounts of data. We created a new series of GDP per capita from 1919 to 1995. And we anchored to the existing series to obtain fully comparable 100 years of GDP per capita figures. Right, so what do we have? I aggregated the Baltic states, the Nordics, and the EU for about the whole 100 years into average series. Interestingly enough, it seems like our growth has been more or less similar in the periods of prosperity and calm in the geopolitical stage. The issue is that both the First World War, Second World War, and the post-communist transition, and even the 2008 crisis was much more pronounced in the Baltic states than in the rest of Europe, or indeed in the Nordics, which leads us to think that our growth potential seems to have been fine. Is that the geopolitical circumstances constantly reduced our ability to grow. So in this graph shows the percentage of European Union as we have it today, plus including the UK. So this is the threshold that people are comparing every country in European Union these days. How far are we still behind the European average? So this shows how far we have been from the European average throughout the 100 years, and it compares the Baltics and East Central Europe without Yugoslavia, so countries like Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Czechia, Slovakia, and before Czechoslovakia. So what's interesting is that we had 4 periods of exceptional strive to achieve these Western standards, to converge towards the West. We tried to reach for them. First of all, before the First World War, it was almost 70% of, like 65% of EU level. Then it dropped again. Then, after the Great Depression, we seem to be catching up well. We almost reached 70% of EU level, and then bang, another war. Then, during the Soviet occupation, I will talk about that data a little bit more, why it's not directly translatable to living standards, but in general, growth was robust, at least until the 1970s, and then again, all growth in the socialist area stops, the Western countries grow, and therefore we see that the Baltic states are declining relative to the EU levels, and only in the last decades we see that the trend has been reversed for the good, contrary to East Central Europe, which seems to have not been approaching EU levels at all until the last decades. So let's look at the interwar first. Between the First and Second World War, there are romantic stories about Latvia, about Estonia, about Lithuania, how prosperous that period was, how much we were able to achieve. The thing is that it's not universal for all the Baltic countries. For Latvia and particularly Estonia, the interwar period was a golden age for sure. These countries were able to approach the European levels. Latvia was the most successful. It had reached 90% of European Union's level in 1938, and this level has not been reached even today by any of the Baltic states. Which means that the Latvia and Estonia as well were more westernized in the interwar period than they are today in terms of GDP per capita, incomes per capita. And what makes it a success story in general is the sound policies, economic policy making that was done during the interwar period by Latvia and Estonia, not Lithuania, in their ability to foster and keep trade levels high. So what happened is that after the crisis, 1929, the biggest economic crisis in the world, Latvia and Estonia quickly abandoned the gold standard. They decided to attach their currencies to pound sterling, which was a floating currency, and therefore keep trade levels high with their main trading partner, which was the UK. Lithuania did not do that, and therefore our levels of trade have not seen any of the levels that the Latvians and Estonians saw. In Estonia, because they devalued their currency fastest, trade levels recovered until 1938, even though in the whole world the trade was still very, very low after the crisis. So this is a short example of how a small country can achieve good results in international stage when all of the world seems to be approaching World War II, closing down and everything, and it seems like all of the decisions are made by the big ones. Latvia and Estonia managed to push through the crisis and achieve significant results during the interwar period through sound policies. Interwar modernization was another issue. We all like to talk about how Latvia invented their radios, how Estonia invented their phones. Lithuania wasn't as good in that sense. the thing is that there are things to be proud of, but there's also things to keep in mind. First, industry was the fastest growing sector during the interwar period for all the Baltic states. That is true. But the thing is that most of the population still worked in the agricultural sector. And therefore the progress that we saw within the industrial sector did not translate into exponential growth of living standards on average. For example, number of tractors per million hectares in all of the 3 Baltic countries was way lower than countries like UK, which were industrialized. So, which means that our most important sector, agriculture, was still rather backward compared to the rest of Europe. And for the rest of the population, a good indicator besides GDP is also electrical power generation. Still, per capita, it was very, very low. But again, you can see that Lithuania is way lower than Latvia and Estonia. So in terms of countries east of Germany, Latvia and Estonia are absolute success stories in the interwar period. In terms of the whole Europe, they're one of the better ones. Now, occupation period, again, data issues tomorrow if anybody is interested, but now we can safely assume that this data is robust enough. So what we have is that during the first decades of occupation period, there truly was quite rapid growth. First of all, the first part of that growth was facilitated by the recovery from the Second World War. That is usual when you have incomes down, devastation and everything. Usually economy picks up pretty fast, and because collectivization was not started to be implemented until 1948-49, there was a rapid growth before that period. Once collectivization measures were in place, growth stagnated, stopped. In Lithuania almost completely, in Estonia as well, in Latvia somewhat less, because more of the country's population was living not from agriculture but from other sources. But in general, up until Khrushchev's new measures of regional economic planning, there was stagnation in income levels. They only started to rapidly rise during Khrushchev's industrialization policies, which allowed the Baltic states to somewhat keep their autonomy and decide on the growth measures themselves. So until 1975, all the Baltic states have surpassed the USSR's average levels, and they seem to be approaching European levels again. Now, why does it then translate to living standards is another issue, because a lot of the productivity that the Baltic peoples managed to achieve was sent through forcibly to the Soviet Union. So when I say the Baltic states reached 80% of EU level in 1975, it does not mean that they lived 75% as good as the average European. Is the productivity of the Baltic workers was that high. Now, what happens after 1975 is the complete stagnation of the whole Soviet bloc, and that includes the Baltic states as well. There is almost no growth in any of the countries during the last decades. And what is interesting is that previous figures seem to be reporting that in 1989 there was a jump in Estonian incomes, a jump in Latvian incomes even in 1990, and Lithuanians too. What the new data shows is that the last year of positive growth, even though that's negligible, in Latvia was in 1986. Since 1986, the economy was going progressively downward. And that plunged, of course, into the post-Soviet transition crisis. Why Lithuania seems to be still growing probably is explained by the massive investments into the nuclear power plant and the oil refinery. Now, I like this slide the most. So this one compares the official Soviet measures in constant price rubles to the newly acquired data in industrial production, but it's kind of the same in the overall growth as well. The red line is the one reported in Soviet rubles, seems to be almost exponentially higher than the new data we calculated. which gives you a clear measure of how inflated due to propaganda were the Soviet official measures, and why you should always at least divide them by 2, if not more, if you want to see anything closer to reality. So, to end this presentation, I think we can distinguish 4 different periods of Baltic economic history, which will allow us to determine where we should place them geographically. In the interwar period, the Baltic states were growing fast, especially after the Great Depression crisis, even surpassed the growth rates of the Nordic countries, while East Central Europe was still plunging down and couldn't even recover. Up until 1938, their average growth was negative. Now, during the first part of the Cold War, again, the Baltic states seems to be almost similar to the rest of the regions we are comparing with, but still showing the best growth rates of them all. Then during the Soviet stagnation, of course, the West picks up way faster than the Baltic states, but still the Baltic states managed to outpace the rest of East Central Europe, which was somewhat half independent. And during the last years, we are analyzing the current period, again, happily, of course, we are converging towards EU levels on similar base than East Central Europe. But what does this show is that absolutely the Baltic states should not be treated as part of East Central Europe, but they should also not be placed as part of Northern Europe. What I argue, and I will argue in my thesis next year, is that the Baltic states are unique and they should be analyzed as a unique, small, compact period of countries which through all their existence, all since 1918, managed to go through incredible hardships and still keep pushing towards the European level, which hasn't been possible for any other post-socialist country. So we should congratulate ourselves. We are kind of unique. Thank you.